Hello, BookTube. It's a gray, raw, rainy day here in Boston and cold, and I went to the Brattle bookshop first thing to chat and to lug books that I don't need. But the carts, the bargain carts that are outside, were uncovered. They were open. I could have browsed them more than I did, but it just isn't congenial weather for that. On a beautiful spring day, when you have an extra hour, there's no better fun for a bookworm than wandering around the Brattle carts, especially since everything there is cheap. The most expensive thing will be $5. But my heart just wasn't in it today. So instead, I shopped a little inside and found two items. That's a rather paltry number, I know, but I wanted to talk about them with you just a bit, and then I'll let you go. And the first one is a Penguin Classic, and it furthers Project Penguin. It allows me to fill out that wall. One of you, the wall in the other room. Those of you who might be new to the channel, Project Penguin was my name for the goal to fill the whole wall with Penguin Classics, and we succeeded. And I got more than a few emails from people saying, well, the next step, of course, is to fill the whole room with penguins. And I'm not actually going to object to that. But the one that I found today is one that I've had before, but I had it in an old mass market paperback that's now falling apart, and it wasn't pretty. It's this. It's Rome and Italy, the Penguin Classic volume of Livy. Only this one it's got this minimalist version. It's got the lovely, artistically chosen cover. You can tell from the hairstyle that, of course, it's from centuries after Livy, but it doesn't matter. The point is it's evocative, and it also has the script spine, which I really like. Not the block white words, but the script. And I don't have a copy of Rome and Italy, so it was fine by me to substitute this for my ratty little mass market wherever it is. It's one of four Penguin Classic volumes that the series the publisher did of Livy. This one is books 6 to 10 of his massive work, Ab Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city. His massive narrative history of Rome, from its proto-mythology, from Romulus and Remus, all the way to the present day, all the way to Livy's own time. He worked on it for his whole life. We don't have all of it, not by a long shot, but he did nothing else. Unlike virtually every other historian, he wasn't a politician, he wasn't a retired general, he wasn't anything like that, he wasn't a lawyer. All he did was write his history and release it in bits and pieces and give readings, and was celebrated in his own day for how brilliant it was, and has been sort of vilified since the Renaissance for how florid it is and how concerned it is with storytelling over factual accuracy. A number of commentators over the centuries have gnashed their teeth at the fact that Livy was living in the same city as a vast trove of historical documents and doesn't appear always to have cared about even consulting them, even walking down the hill and consulting them. Although he does consult far more than his naysayers give him credit. A famous British historian in the Victorian era, of course, famously quipped that he shows less interest in the truth than any other historian, and then has to amend his criticism by saying, but we've never seen an example of a bad thing done this well, because Livy is spellbinding. And the back cover copy of this volume, this is books 6 through 10 of the history, largely concerned Rome's fight with a rival city-state in central Italy, the city of the Samnites, a tough and military people, a tough opponent, then basically fought for domination of the central part of Italy, and Rome won, but it took a long time, and there were many setbacks, including an epic battle that I don't really know that much about, but we know that the Romans considered it epic because Livy gives it the full dress treatment. But the back cover copy, this is the original translation by the great Betty Radis, and they've never updated it. And the back cover copy says, Betty Radis's translation fully preserves the clear, articulate style of the original. And it pains me to say it about my beloved Penguin Classic, but that line is simply not true. And getting a new edition of Livy in English, and getting ready to put it in the inventory and put it on the shelf and maybe put all the Livy volumes together, made me think about it even more. And a point that I've raised on this channel a few times about classic literature and translation, and my growing conviction that it can't be done, which is a terrible conviction to have, because if I start to fully believe that, what do I say to young people? To most of you? What do I say to most of you when you ask me, well, where should I start with Roman historians? Am I going to reach a point when I'm older than 28 in which I say, you don't? You can't read them unless you can read Latin? I would hate to think that I would get to that point, and yet English and Latin are two very different languages. In English, much depends on word order. So, in an English sentence, a strong wind struck the old barn. You know immediately what that sentence says and what each adjective is doing in that sentence. If you change that sentence to a wind struck the old strong barn, no one reading that is going to think that strong applies to wind. No one's going to do that. They're going to assume that those two adjectives are near barn because they both apply to barn. And you can't do it any other way. There's no way in English for you to signal anything else. And in Latin, that's not the case. Largely, that's not the case. In Latin, it's like strong and wind are bonded visually, so that you don't need to worry about where they go in the sentence. A reader of the sentence will know from what they look like that they go together, and that old and barn go together. They'll know looking at the sentences that's true. They won't have to worry about where the words are in the sentence. And if you think about it, once you unmoor words from their place in the sentence, once you have a language in which you don't have to worry about that, a vast amount of possibilities open up if you are a master of what you're doing. And Livy was the greatest master of his day, even, I think, greater than Virgil at what he was doing. You can picture some of it, right? Even in a simple English sentence. A strong wind struck the old barn is a very different thing in English from a wind struck the strong old barn, right? A strong wind struck the old barn, in addition to telling you where the adjectives go in the sentence, also starts to tell a story, right? It raises doubt in your mind, worry in your mind about the barn, because the wind is strong and the barn is old. Now look what happens to that very thing, even in English, even in simple English, when you move the adjectives. A wind struck the strong old barn gives a completely different story. All of a sudden, strong and old are not working at cross purposes. They're actually reinforcing each other. All of a sudden, you're not worried about the barn, because you don't know anything about the wind, but you know that the barn is strong and old, a strong old barn. And if that switch in English can cause such a radical shift in your understanding of the sentence, imagine what total freedom along those lines could do in the hands of an absolute master. And if you imagine that, and then you imagine not a simple, simplistic English sentence, but rather sentences that go on for pages, where the meanings are rippling constantly as you read it, because you don't know where things are going to end up. You don't know where the emphasis is going to end up, and sometimes until the very last word of a 2-page long sentence. And sometimes that word is not what you expect. Sometimes, often, in the hands of a master, that rippling feeling ends with a kicker, something you didn't see coming, something that revises your opinion of the sentence you have been reading. I might not be doing a good job of explaining it, but the reason for that is because there is no equivalent in English. There simply isn't. And I've known that for my whole life, but still, I sometimes am reluctant to come to grips with what you're saying if you say that thing X in Latin has no equivalent in English. The thing you're saying, if you say that, is that a writer of Latin who is taking advantage of thing X is not translatable. And that's a little sad. So, and I was thinking of those things while I was thumbing through this book and rereading bits and pieces of it. I will probably end up rereading it all, but it won't be. When I reread it, it won't be to spend time with Livy. I have my Loeb Classical Library editions for that. I have the Oxford edition of Livy for that, in the actual Latin, annotated Latin edition. What I'll do when I reread this is spend time with Betty Radis, who, along with Dorothy Sayers and Constance Garnett and all these other groundbreaking, massively learned mid-century women who no one has written the book about them that really needs to be written. I was spending time with her. I was spending time with her delightful, poised word choice. Her English version of Livy is what I will be rereading. But in addition to, this Livy it's right in the middle of the early part of his work. It's not a beginning, it's not an ending. And the same thing applies to the second book that I got today. It's not a beginning and it's not an ending. It's right in the middle. It's The Commodore by Patrick O'Brian. This is book 17 in his series of adventures starring the Royal Navy Captain Jack Aubrey and his Irish surgeon and best friend and spy master, Stephen Maturin. And it starts in Master and Commander, and it moves forward at a very idiosyncratic pace. Patrick O'Brian is not really concerned with wrapping things up neatly. He's not really concerned with keeping you up to date. A couple of perceptive critics of the whole series, when it was winding towards its end, commented to the effect that the 20 books in the series really constitute one enormously long novel. And I'm sure that I agree with that completely. Sometimes O'Brian does seem aware of the fact that he's writing a discrete book that's going to be the only Aubrey and Maturin adventure that his readers read in that year, and that maybe he therefore ought to give it something a roughly approximated beginning and something roughly approximating an ending. He is often aware enough to do that. There are some books that just are integumentary tissue only. They don't have either one, and you just have to be reading them for the fun of it. You couldn't possibly pick them up and get anything out of them. I don't think you could. Maybe you could. I can't imagine. The Commodore is not one of those books. The Commodore actually does have the approximation of a beginning, middle, and end. It starts off with our heroes returning home from far-flung voyages that they've been on, and they've been successful and they're wealthy and they retire to the countryside. And the reason that it has a narrative integrity of its own is because they are then called back into service for a discrete mission that has its entire existence in this book and comes to a conclusion in this book. So you could, with a bit of effort, a bit of mental effort on your order, maybe a little Googling, you could pick up the Commodore and read it as your very first Aubrey and Maturin book. I urge you not to. If you're interested in the series, and you should be, you should read this series. I would urge you to start with Master and Commander, because Master and Commander is when Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin meet for the first time. And it feels good to start there. By the time we get to the Commodore, they have been through everything together: shipwreck and mutiny and war, and O'Brian's action sequences. You have to experience them to believe them. They're very. You read along in this stodgy Jane Austen style narrative voice, and you think, okay, I'm not going to be nudged out of my easy chair by anything here. And then you get to ships clearing for action and firing on each other, and the whole thing just electrifies. That happens a couple of times in this book. But the thing that struck me, that has always struck me about the Commodore, there are a few scenes in here that I absolutely love. For instance, this is the book where Stephen Maturin learns that his young daughter is autistic. She's just a little girl, and he's a surgeon, and he's an enlightened man, and we see through a fictitious busybody, Jack Aubrey's mother-in-law, we see what fate would have awaited a girl like that had she not had Stephen Maturin in her life. Had her autism been viewed instead as stubbornness, And the mother-in-law actually self-satisfiedly mentions horrifying things like beatings or starvings or a black hole, which is just as awful as it sounds. And you think about, I mean, you're meant to, O'Brien is trying to bring it to your mind. You think about the horrors that so many millions of people must have experienced in the course of humankind. And you're all the more grateful that Stephen Maturin is willing to put his will and his resources into protecting everyone he meets. It's kind of a neat moment. But my favorite moment in this book happens relatively early on in the book, where Maturin is visiting Aubrey at his country house, and it's quiet. It's nighttime. He's gone to bed. I want to read you a bit of it, as tedious as that is. There's only 2 books, and we're almost done. But I can't. I love this passage whenever I encounter it. I'll read you 2 long paragraphs. O'Brien loves to write, and he doesn't love to punctuate, so bear with me. Stephen had been put to sleep in his usual room, far from children and noise, away in that corner of the house which looked down on the orchard and the bowling green, and in spite of his long absence it was so familiar to him that when he woke about 3, he made his way to the window almost as quickly as if dawn had already broken, opened it, and walked out onto the balcony. The moon had set. There was barely a star to be seen. The still air was delightfully fresh with falling dew, and a late nightingale, in indifferent voice, was uttering a routine jug far down Jack's plantations. Closer at hand, and more agreeable by far, nightjars chirred in the orchard, 2 of them, or perhaps 3, the sound rising and falling, intertwining so that the source could not be made out for sure. There were few birds he preferred to nightjars, but it was not that had brought him out of bed. He stood leaning there on the balcony rail, and presently Jack Aubrey, in a summer house by the bowling green, began again, playing very gently in the darkness, improvising wholly for himself on his violin, dreaming away with a mastery that Stephen had never heard equaled, though they had played together for years and years. Now, in the warm night, there was no one to be comforted. O'Brien mentions that when they play on board ship, Jack is matching his skill level to anyone they can find who can join in, including Maturin. And he goes on, now in the warm night there was no one to be comforted, kept in countenance, no one who could scorn him for virtuosity, and he could let himself go entirely. And as the grave and subtle music wound on and on, Stephen once more contemplated on the apparent contradiction between the big, cheerful, florid sea officer, whom most people liked on sight, but who would never have been described as subtle or capable of subtlety by any of them, except perhaps his surviving opponents in battle, and the intricate, reflective music he was now creating, so utterly unlike his limited vocabulary and words, at times verging on the inarticulate. My hands have now regained the moderate ability they possessed before I was tortured, observed Maturin, but his have gone on to a point I never thought he could reach, his hands and his mind. I am amazed. In his own way, he is the secret man of the world, but I wish his music were happier. It's a rare author, especially of C.F. Forster, Dewey Lambton style, Napoleonic, seafaring adventure novels. It's a rare author who can pause to give you a moment like that, who has the confidence to do it and the skill to pull it off. And I just love it. I absolutely love it. I love the rest of the book too, but that always gets to me. So this goes on the shelf because, like Project Penguin, I am in the slow process of reacquiring in hardcover all of Patrick O'Brian, which I have had and lost several times. I'm hoping this will be the last time. So there you have it. I'm sorry for the length of the video and for the wool gathering, but I just thought I would point out this is a small book day. I'm wondering if the chilly rain and the overcast just means I won't get any mail today. It could easily happen. My mail carriers, if they're making a special trip for me, if there's a tub or something like that, and it's inclement and they'd rather not, they know perfectly well I'm not going to mind. I'm not going to raise a ruckus. I'm not going to call headquarters. So it might be that I have to wait until sunshine. But in the meantime, I thought I would show you these 2 books. There's Livy, Rome and Italy, and there's The Commodore by Patrick O'Brian. Now, they're in the odd position here, the 2 books of this video, in not actually being recommendations, which is kind of strange. I do wholeheartedly recommend that those of you who are inclined, try Livy in the Penguin Classic translations if you don't have the Latin, because it will give you something. It won't give you, the more I think about it, Livy, but it will give you something. It will give you as close an impression in English as you can get. And I earnestly urge you all to find a copy of Master and Commander and read it. And if it hooks you, and I feel certain that if you give it time, it will, you'll be reading the Commodore in no time at all. You'll wish there were more books. But anyway, there you go. That's a rather small little day, and I'll see you soon, Book 2. Thank you.